I'm Lauren Layfield, and you're listening to Your Next Podcast. This is the podcast that brings you a different series every single week, helping you to find your new favourite show. Do you like space? I love space stuff. It freaks me out. I find it quite fascinating. I've been looking a lot at videos online about black holes recently. Maybe, in that case, you've listened to the podcast 13 Minutes to the Moon, with seasons all about the first people to walk on the moon and the near disaster of Apollo 13. Well, the team behind that show are back with a brand new podcast called 16 Sunsets, and this one is all about the space shuttle. So it's the story of NASA's gamble to maintain relevance, public interest, and crucially, money by developing a reusable spacecraft. It's as much a political achievement as it is a scientific one, with national and global issues colliding, leading NASA to make a pact with the US military that would change the direction of the agency forever. And this story is told by the people who were there at the time, and it really is worth listening to if this sounds like your sort of thing. So this is 16 Sunsets.
This is Shuttle Control Houston at minus 20 minutes and holding. There's a mood of calm in mission control as a silver team of flight controllers monitoring the final minutes before the launch of Columbia on her first voyage into space.
STS-1, the first mission of NASA's Space Transportation System. Space Shuttle Columbia stands on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral on a clear, cold morning. Strapped to its external tank, now filled with rocket propellant and oxygen and flanked by two boosters, it hisses and creaks in the Florida sunshine.
T-minus 7 minutes and counting, and we have retraction of the orbiter access arm beginning to move.
This mission has been a long time coming. Designers and engineers have been working on it since before Armstrong and Aldrin set foot on the moon in 1969. More than a decade in the making, it is the realization of many dreams. And this date, the 12th of April 1981, is 20 years to the day since cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to venture into space.
T-minus 6 minutes, 29 seconds and counting.
This too is a historic mission. Shuttle is a spacecraft like none other before it, a far cry from the cramped, conical capsules that first ferried astronaut crews into orbit and onward to the moon.
T-minus 5 minutes, 59 seconds and counting. Pilot Bob Crippen had begun that APU pre-start, which...
Shuttle is fast. A space plane 120 feet long, reusable and capable of lifting a crew of 7 and nearly 25 tons of payload into orbit. It is a vision of the future.
Coming up on the 5-minute point. 4, 3, 2, 1, mark. T-minus 5 minutes and counting.
For this first flight, an audacious all-up test of the hardware, only 2 astronauts are aboard. In the left seat, Commander John Young, a veteran with 4 space missions already under his belt. And to his right, rookie Bob Crippen, strapped into his seat, preparing to journey into space for the first time.
Everything going very smoothly in this count.
Thousands are gathered at the Cape. Thousands more line the surrounding beaches. And around the world, millions watch the live broadcast on television with bated breath.
T-minus 3 minutes, 57 seconds and counting. The final helium purge on the...
Shuttle severs its connections with the ground. Fuel, power, and guidance. Until now, it's been dependent upon the launch pad and the pad crew to keep it going. Like a patient strapped to a life support machine. But it's about to cut loose from Mother Earth.
T-minus 2 minutes, 40 seconds and counting.
There can be no more holds now. The shuttle must launch or abort completely in the next 150 seconds.
T-minus 2 minutes, 15 seconds. The pressure in the LOX tank is at flight pressure.
The system is dynamic, building towards something irresistible. To a moment where there will be no safer option than to light the solid rocket boosters and leave the world behind.
T-minus 40 seconds and counting. The development flight instrumentation recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching to the redundant...
Columbia's cluster of onboard computers takes over from ground control. It is the mother of all baton passes.
T-minus 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15, 14, 13... T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. Liftoff of America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower. Back arrow go back. Go. Roger roll.
Huge billowing clouds engulf the pad below as shuttle ascends. More than 2,000 tons of spacecraft accelerate from 0 to 60 miles an hour in the first 7 seconds. With the boosters alight and the main engines building power, it breaks the sound barrier less than 40 seconds later. It is an unforgettable sight. The most exotic, the most capable space vehicle ever built, arcing through the sky, the first of its kind. It is arguably NASA's greatest achievement, more consequential in many ways than the moon landings, with a legacy stretching across 135 missions and 30 years. But why was it so capable and at the same time so very fragile? Why was it so different from all that came before it? And how did it come into being? I'm Kevin Fong, and this is 16 Sunsets, the extraordinary, untold story of Space Shuttle. Episode 1, The Dreamers. So, this is my memory of April the 12th, 1981. I was 9 years old, and I'm sitting cross-legged on the cold floor of a classroom, and my teacher, Miss Parfit, rolls the TV in, and it's on wheels, and it's got a wood veneer cabinet with barn doors to keep the sun off the screen. And she flicks it on, and it takes a while to warm up, as TVs did in that day. And we can hear the words coming through, and we don't really understand them. It's the NASA announcer telling us that something wonderful is about to happen. And even to 9-year-old me, there was this unmistakable air of excitement. And I was a child of the space age. I was born into an era where spaceflight was already possible, where people had already journeyed into space and walked on the moon. And so this endeavor, at the edge of possibility, looked to me like the boundary between science fiction and science fact, and a future that was as bright as it was hopeful. And when Shuttle took to the sky, I think for me, and I think for all of us to a degree in that classroom and classrooms across the world, it was a symbol of all that was to come, and a future in which there might be a place for everyone, in which anything at all that you could dream might be possible. And so the story of Shuttle starts in the minds of a new generation who were oblivious to the conflict and forces that had brought this spacecraft into being and shaped its form, and who instead saw only the dream and the first page of a story steeped in hope. So I wanted to make this podcast to retread that story, to go in search of those dreams and that hope, and to understand how and why the shuttle came to be, and to go back to a time before Challenger, before Columbia, to tell its remarkable origin story and the road to that first mission. To do that, we have to turn the clock back again to the excitement of the late 1960s, with NASA on the verge of landing on the moon and NASA's designers and engineers in search of a new dream.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
1968, and the crew of Apollo 8 is coasting across the surface of a new world for the first time in human history.
From the waters, and God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament.
From their orbit around the moon, the crew will see Earth rise above the lunar horizon, hanging like an unblemished jewel against the darkness, borderless and at peace.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth.
But the Earth is anything but good. A tumultuous year, 1968, marked by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, capping a decade scarred by international tensions and tragedy. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in '63, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And in the same year that Frank Borman, James Lovell, and Bill Anders first orbit the moon, the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia. Christmas it may be, but there is no sense of an armistice. Amidst the unrest, NASA is still looking to the future, looking for adventures beyond Project Apollo.
Dad was always good at building model airplanes. He loved to work with balsa wood and tissue paper. And there were a lot of models you could buy at the store of replica airplanes. You could build them as gliders or, they'd even have a little plastic propeller on them. But he actually built this one from his own design. And it was very intricate with lots of ribs for the fuselage and the leading edges of the wings and the, wing spars and such. And then he would cover it with tissue paper and did quite an excellent job. So he started working on one of those right out in his own garage.
Guy Faget, son of NASA's legendary rocket designer Max Faget, talking to us about his father's early attempts to reshape the future of human spaceflight.
He would take it out in the backyard and test glide it, and that was kind of fun to watch him. A lot of times I would go pick it up and bring it back to him, just right in our backyard behind our porch, in between our porch and the bayou that ran through our backyard. And he was always had a very keen eye as he watched it glide. I'm really not sure what he was looking for. I know they talked about a certain angle of reentry, and it was probably going to get very hot coming back into the atmosphere, of course. And it would glide, maybe 10 or 15 feet before it settled in the grass.
But away from Faget's dreams, even before NASA had landed on the moon, cold political reality was beginning to creep in.
By the mid-1960s, it was clear that there would have to be plans for a next project.
That's Teasel Muir Harmony, a historian and curator of the Apollo collection at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
What was going to happen after the Apollo program, after we sent humans to the moon. And within NASA, there were many discussions, really ambitious plans, including Mars exploration ideas. And when President Nixon took office, he was interested in thinking about what the future of space exploration should be for the United States, and really wanted to move away from the Project Apollo model.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 20. Down a half. 30 seconds forward. Good.
For some, the sprint to the moon, successful though it was, had been a distraction. NASA's vision for the future of space exploration was far grander.
NASA didn't start out wanting to just go on a sprint. That was forced by President Kennedy.
NASA legend John Aaron, engineer, econ flight controller, and savior of more than one Apollo mission.
In the back of their mind, they wanted to inch out into space. First, to build a space station in low Earth orbit, which could be both the transportation node for departing to the moon and on to Mars.
Project Apollo is regarded by some as an aberration, a feat of technology, science, and engineering that more properly belonged in the 21st century. but that was somehow dragged into the 1960s because of the demands of the Cold War. And it's an opinion shared by some of NASA's most visionary leaders.
Everyone was convinced that we had leapfrogged from orbital flight to lunar flight and completely left out a space station.
Max Faget was NASA's chief engineer, in effect, its head of design. Here he is speaking to Johnson Space Center's Oral History Project in 1997.
Space station seemed like an obvious thing to do, to have a laboratory in space where people could work and we could understand microgravity effects both on people as well as on physical processes a lot better with the laboratory than we could in these tiny capsules. So there was a big effort towards the beginning in the middle of the Apollo program and increasing as we went along toward building a rather large laboratory for flight.
In the mid-1960s, Faget and his team still clung to this vision, hoping that once the space race was done, a more sustainable path to a more expansive and ambitious future might be forged. But public opinion and political priorities were shifting.
This is a time when the Apollo program was receiving a lot of critique for being extraordinarily expensive. Over 4% of the federal budget by the mid-1960s. It was only around the first lunar landing that over half the country thought this was a good national investment. And instead, people thought that the United States should be investing in issues like housing and urban development and the issues that people are facing in their day-to-day lives.
And under Nixon, it's not just the Apollo program that's at risk of being axed. Matthew Hirsch is Harvard historian of science and technology and author of Dark Star, A New History of the Space Shuttle.
NASA is very successful at landing on the moon. And after that, many in government, particularly in the Republican Party, don't see any reason for any kind of spaceflight program at all, particularly not a human spaceflight program. And there are also calls in Democratic circles to turn that money toward more humanistic pursuits, resolving the issues with poverty and racial disparity in the United States. And so finding a program, a reason for NASA to exist after the successful moon landings of Project Apollo is a challenge.
It was politics that had catalyzed the space program. The need for the United States to demonstrate its technological superiority over the communist Soviet Union. But it was politics that now threatened its future.
Nobody wanted to do away with the space program. Nobody was willing to pay for it in any shape or form, whereas the Congress or the White House and many of the aerospace industries were absolutely non-supportive. The White House, in the form of Mr. Nixon, he didn't give a damn about the space program. He showed up on the carrier when Apollo 11 landed to get his face on television and make the most of it politically. From that point on, he helped us none.
That's the formidable Chris Kraft speaking in 2009. Kraft was director of human spaceflight operations during Project Apollo and famed for being an outspoken straight shooter.
He did not support the space program. He just didn't want to kill it because he knew it was one of the inspirational things in the country, and he knew that would not go over very well. The same is true of the Congress. In contrast to the way it was in Apollo. In Apollo, we had a commitment in this country, not just from the people working who were space cadets, not just the 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo program, because they were marvelous. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the fact that we had the commitment from the Congress, we had the commitment from the White House, we had the commitment from the OMB, or whatever they were called at that point in time. They argued with us, fought with us on many occasions, but they were dedicated to getting it done. They were committed, and they knew the country was committed to doing Apollo. When it came to the shuttle, they didn't give a damn. One of the biggest disappointments of anybody's life in the space program was that come the end of Apollo, people could care less about the space program.
Faced with this challenge, NASA have to conceive a program capable of winning hearts, minds, but most importantly of all, funding from the politicians on Capitol Hill. But there are very few good ideas on the table. NASA looks set to abandon the moon not long after the decade is out, and the idea of embarking upon expeditions to Mars, with human spaceflight still in its infancy, looks to many like expensive fantasy. And so NASA's human spaceflight program begins the long fall back to Earth. But in this, Max Faget and his acolytes recognize an opportunity to build firmer foundations for the future of human space exploration.
What they imagined was perhaps a form of infrastructure that would allow the United States to explore the solar system, which would involve space stations, interplanetary vehicles, and some kind of craft that would enable astronauts to travel to and from Earth orbit and bring cargo with them very cheaply.
It became obvious that we needed a better vehicle for servicing. Gemini was too small, Apollo was too expensive, and it almost looked like an overkill. So we started looking at a brand new vehicle.
If you're going to build a space station, if you're going to go back to the moon, if you're going to go to Mars, if you're going to do things that make space commonplace from an industrial point of view, then you have to have a space transportation system. That's where it starts. So that's where we said, well, that's okay, that's what we'll do. We'll go with that.
But committing to that decision was only half the battle. NASA now faced the harsh realities of securing government funding. Key to achieving this would be reducing costs, and that in turn would force NASA to embrace a concept that had been absent from the single-use vehicles of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo eras: reusability.
The politics and economics back in the early 70s, towards the end of the Apollo program, really dictated that if NASA wanted to have a continuing human spaceflight program, they couldn't continue to do it with the Saturn hardware.
Jeff Hoffman is Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT and a former NASA astronaut. I've known him a long time. Jeff flew on 5 shuttle flights, including the outlandish mission to service and repair the Hubble Space Telescope in 1993.
The cost of the Apollo program really convinced people at NASA, rightly so, as we've seen now, given the successes of SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, that reusability was the key to affordable spaceflight. So NASA got it right on that point. How are you going to do reusability? Well, nowadays we've gotten used to seeing these rocket first stages land, targeted on almost on the bullseye every time. But think about the controls that are required, the high-speed digital computers that you need to manage that landing. And then you look at the computer that was available for the space shuttle. There's just no way that we could have landed vertically back in the 1960s when the shuttle first started to be designed. And so reusability basically meant landing on a runway, which meant you had an airplane with wings.
A winged space vehicle was music to the ears of astronauts who saw themselves as pilots first and spacefarers second, and who found the experience of returning to Earth in a capsule almost humiliating.
So Mike Cullen's book, Carrying the Fire, his chapter on the shuttle is called Wings and Wheels at Last.
David Mindell, author of Digital Apollo and professor of astronautics at MIT.
Finally, the pilots come back to landing on a proper runway instead of, and these are Collins' words, instead of getting fished out of the ocean like a bag of soggy cats. Finally, we're sending an airplane into orbit, which is crazy if you think about it in retrospect.
Crazy, perhaps. But the idea of flying in space is everywhere in the science fiction of the 20th century, all the way from Flash Gordon to Luke Skywalker's Death Star run. Jennifer Levasseur is a historian and shuttle curator at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
The design of the shuttle goes back decades, if not centuries, to thinking about flight, just generally speaking. The idea of going into space and being able to sort of coast around even though there's no atmosphere. So it really wasn't understood by people who were creating things like Buck Rogers back in the 20s and 30s. And so, of course, if we were to go into space, we should be able to go to and from space in something that looks like a plane. That turned out not to be the best plan, because making something like a plane, shaped like an airplane, function and move between those environments is incredibly technically challenging. And that really sets the stage for the shuttle program.
It's an audacious concept, but NASA is an agency with a reputation for bringing the impossible into being, and it is undaunted. This exotic, reusable spaceplane would come with a hefty upfront price tag, and to make it pay for itself, NASA needed something else: customers.
If you have a reusable system, you only save money if you use it a lot. And so the idea was NASA was going to take over with the shuttle the launch of all satellites, which had to include military satellites. And the military, of course, they were an absolute requirement for NASA to get the political approval and the economic approval from the Office of Management and Budget to go ahead with the shuttle.
But the military were not the only customers. Teasel Muir Harmony again.
Part of the expectation was that the shuttle would offer an opportunity to be this great all-purpose vehicle to serve the civilian and the military space programs, but also this idea that we needed to encourage industry investment in space and make space and low Earth orbit a new era of industry.
While Max Faget and his designers yearned for a future filled with soaring space planes, the Nixon administration had its own dreams, a space program fueled by market forces.
I think the most important political element or aspect to the story of the space shuttle is the rise of a kind of new space policy associated with the new right in the United States.
Harvard historian Matthew Hirsch.
The space policy of the new right is more focused on two very specific goals. One is the militarization of the space environment, in which the space shuttle seems like a very useful tool. And the other is creating a kind of commercial space in space, turning NASA possibly into a profit-generating institution, or using it to develop technologies that will immediately enrich American companies, many of which are actually important Republican campaign donors. And so the space shuttle is heralded not so much as a tool of universal brotherhood, as Nixon sometimes refers to it, but as something that's going to give a new, not quite conservative American political right exactly the kind of space program it really wants.
This blend of market forces and military clients, alongside a civilian program of scientific exploration, made for a very odd cocktail.
The Air Force is approached by NASA at the request of the Nixon administration to find a partner to justify constructing this craft. And this is problematic right off the bat because NASA is a civilian institution which is supposed to be engaged in scientific research for the benefit of all humankind. So the idea that it would have a vehicle that was military or classified would have been an anathema to the NASA of the 1960s. In fact, astronauts of the 1960s were not allowed to wear their military uniforms while they were in NASA service because NASA wanted to communicate quite clearly that this was a civilian agency and not a military service branch. There was no Space Force, and there would never be.
But the partnership is forged out of pure necessity.
NASA begs the Air Force to participate because NASA knows that there's no way the Nixon administration will approve the shuttle unless there's some form of Air Force agreement. But the Air Force is never an enthusiastic partner. It doesn't like the configuration of the vehicle. It's not happy with the size. It doesn't like the solid rocket boosters. It doesn't think that they're safe. And in the end, NASA doesn't get any commitment to funds. It doesn't even get support. All the Air Force says is, basically they will not prevent NASA from acquiring it, and if it turns out that it works, they'll use it, but they're not going to spend any money on developing it. But that's enough for the Nixon administration, and they proceed.
NASA's administrator, Dr. James Fletcher, flew out to California to explain the new space shuttle system to President Nixon. In a statement announcing...
The presidential rubber stamp alone is not enough. NASA still needs the Senate and Congress to approve. And there is fierce opposition. America is on the brink of recession. A year earlier, Democrat Senator Walter Mondale tabled a motion that would have killed the project completely. The vote is close. But in April of 1972, funding is finally approved. And at NASA, there's a sigh of relief from Houston all the way to the lunar surface.
Hey, John, this is perfect with the LIM and the rover.
And I remember John Young on Apollo 16 was the day they were on the surface of the moon, the day the Congress approved the program to go forward, the shuttle program.
Apollo 13 flight director Jerry Griffin.
And he commented on it. He commented on, we need that shuttle. And in typical Georgia accent, we need that shuttle. And we need that thing to be flying.
This looks like a good time for some good news here. The House passed a space budget yesterday, 277 to 60, which includes a vote for the shuttle. Wonderful. Tony, again, I'll say it with that salute. I'm proud to be an American. I'll tell you, what a program, and what a place, and what an experience. Yeah, and I'll say it too. So my country needs that shuttle mighty bad.
But the mission is far from over. Budget approval is only for the initial phases of the shuttle program. And it's not a blank check. More battles would need to be fought and won if the project was to be saved. And so, in 1973, NASA sends for someone who understands a thing or two about saving missions against all the odds. Jerry Griffin. Griffin, now nearly 90, remains impish in character and as sharp as he's ever been. Every bit the fearless flight director who went on to become director of Johnson Space Center and who NASA seemed to send anywhere there was a fire that needed putting out.
I got a call from Chris Kraft, who said, George Lowe and Jim Fletcher, the deputy administrator and the administrator, want to talk to you about a job. And I said, what? And he said, just get your rear end on an airplane, get up there and talk, let them tell you what they got in mind. And so I did. They said, we want you to be the head of legislative affairs. And I thought to myself, I'm a Texas A&M aeronautical engineer. I hardly know which side the Senate and the House is on. But they said, we almost lost it in 1971. So what they were looking for is somebody to help them get the message to the Hill, to the Congress, what the shuttle was all about and what it was and why it was different. And they needed somebody that understood it technically. So they picked me. So I said, okay, if you guys want. I was 38 years old. I said, okay, if you want, we'll give her a go. And I was the first guy in that job that was not a lawyer.
Griffin swaps mission control in Houston for Washington's corridors of power. He and NASA's deputy administrator, George Lowe, set up a war room. On the wall, they paste the names of hundreds of senators and members of Congress, and they begin their intense campaign to win over hearts and minds. The experience is bruising.
We talked to the friendlies and we talked to the ones that were against us. And we kind of walked out with our bloodied nose a couple of times almost, but it was a real education for me because it really threw me into this political cauldron. And it's like making sausage. You don't want to watch it. It's pretty grim. I used to be 6'6". I'm about 5'7" now. It wore me down. It was a hard job. It was dawn till dark, and every night.
Through the building of strange partnerships and political bargaining, Griffin has kept the dream alive. He has saved yet another mission and is once again the hero of the hour. But success here comes at a price.
There were so many compromises, political compromises that led to technological compromises that led to fatalities that, I wonder whether it was really the right thing to do. They were plugged into the dream. They still are plugged into the dream, and the dream takes precedence over a lot of other things.
NASA could perhaps have waited for a more refined solution or a program steeped in less compromise. But as all those involved in human spaceflight operations know, perfect is often the enemy of good enough. What would have happened if you'd failed in that task? Because it was close, as you said, it was close and nearly did get killed by Congress.
Yeah.
What would have happened if Shuttle hadn't flown?
That if the shuttle hadn't flown, if it had gotten killed by the Congress or some process, we may have gone into a long hiatus on human spaceflight. I think in America we would have been in trouble trying to cook up something that would keep our foot in the water. I think there was a majority of Congress that always felt that we had to stay in it. But we would have been in trouble if the shuttle had not made it.
Conceived from ambition, but born of compromise, the Space Shuttle would define NASA's mission and human space exploration for the next 3 decades. But first, it had to be built. And NASA would soon find out that when it comes to working with the military, the devil really is in the detail.
The budget that President Nixon was willing to lay out for this forced NASA into some big compromises that wound up in a vehicle that, with respect to exploring space, got overlaid with some big military requirements. It's like designing a horse by committee. You wind up with a camel.
Next time on 16 Sunsets.
I can now tell you, I guess, just a few of us were cleared for secret.
And this was supposed to be one of these where you don't tell anybody where you're going, don't tell your family where you're going to be.
I personally believe it helped us win the Cold War.
"16 Sunsets" is written and presented by Kevin Fong and produced by Rami Zabar and Andrew Luck Baker, with additional production by Dave Giles. For the music, we're very lucky to be working with Christian Lundberg again, from Hans Zimmer's Bleeding Fingers Composers Collective. The sound design and mixing is by Richard Curtis. The executive producers are Rami Zabar, Kevin Fong, and Jago Lee, and it's a Telltale and Antica production for the Acast Creator Network, with special thanks to Sandra Johnson and NASA's Johnson Space Center Oral History Project. The podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of our amazing Kickstarter community of backers. For this episode, we'd particularly like to thank co-executive producers Chris Crockford, Steve Dennison, and Dirk Paisler, and associate producers Michael Rennick, John Rowlands, Elizabeth McIntyre, Nick Barron, Floris Holmes, Ed Wright, and Corinna Kidd. Thank you for listening. We're at the start of a brave new adventure, and a new episode of 16 Sunsets will drop every 2 weeks. I really hope you'll stick with us for the whole story. We'll be adding a number of bonus episodes into the feed as well. So subscribe, like, share, and leave us a review. It really helps other people to find us. And tell us what you think. Look for @16 Sunsets on X, and we're on Instagram too.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And if you liked it, there's a couple more episodes available right now with the rest of the series releasing weekly. So search for 16 Sunsets in your podcast app. And you can find all my recommendations along with news, reviews and much more on Podcast Rex at www.podcastrex.com. That's www.podcastrex.com.